Hello, I'm Sean Lay. Welcome to the programme which brings together UK commentators, BBC specialists and foreign correspondents who file their stories for audiences at home, Dateline London. This weekend, as Christians celebrate Easter and renewal, we're devoting the programme to one theme. After the pandemic, can we renew our world? And is reconciliation possible when people in so much of it seem so angry? To try to answer that, joining me, Catherine Pepinster. Catherine was the first woman to edit The Tablet, the international Catholic newspaper. Michael Goldberg, veteran foreign correspondent for US Public Radio. His podcast, FRDH, is inspired by the ambition of journalism as the first rough draft of history. And with me in the studio, the BBC broadcaster and China specialist, Vincent Nee. Welcome to all of you. It's good to have you with us this Easter weekend. Now, Pope Francis, who delivers his Easter message for a second year from inside the Basilica rather than to the thousands of Catholics who gather most years in St Peter's Square in Rome, practiced what he preaches when last month he made the first ever papal visit to Iraq. He was seeking not only to reconcile Christianity and Islam, but also to inspire Muslims to heal the division within their faith. Yet faith is weaponised in conflicts around the world, used, if you'll pardon the expression, to demonise minorities. China, this weekend marking Qingming, the tomb-sweeping festival, stands accused of justifying conversion and suppression of Uyghurs on the grounds of their faith, Islam. It now permits Catholics to worship. Is that reconciliation, or is the Vatican being co-opted to Beijing's cause? How credible is reconciliation in Brazil or the United States, where politics is now so polarised and, perhaps not coincidentally, so ineffectual? In a global pandemic, which we're all in together, why are we so angry with each other, especially when it's manifestly not in our own best interest? Catherine Pepinster, let's start with the Pope. I mean, this visit to Iraq was, on a personal level, in terms of his own safety, quite a big risk to run. It's the first time a Pope has been to Iraq, even it's one of the countries that, you know, what it was once part of Mesopotamia, one of the birthplaces of Christianity. And it had quite a message that was designed to resonate well beyond that one country.
Yes, you're absolutely right, Sean. This was a historic occasion for the Pope to go to Iraq, but he was really quite committed to this for a very long time, trying to get it organised. And he wanted to take there a message of reconciliation. And reconciliation is a word that has come up time and time again throughout the 8 years that Francis has been Pope. And I think if you look at his writings, when he mentions reconciliation, he also always mentions dialogue, that reconciliation means you have to talk to people. You have to find ways through your differences. And he was also keen in that visit to show his solidarity with the Christian minorities there. They've had such a terrible time in recent years. But alongside solidarity with one particular group, he's saying you've got to talk to the other side, as it were, as well. You've got to have that encounter, and I think it's something that we see such a lack of at the moment in our world. You've mentioned some of the countries in your introduction where this is such a problem, but we've also seen in places in the past, such as in South Africa and Northern Ireland, that reconciliation and dialogue can make a difference.
Michael, it might seem a trite thing to say, but there are plenty of people who will be watching this programme who I suspect will be thinking, well, it's all very well to say what the Pope is trying to do, but religion, whether the religious people themselves want it to be this way or not, probably they don't, but religion has been used as a justification for what is otherwise unjustifiable in terms of violence, in terms of political and economic colonisation, as well as subjugation. Is faith the problem here rather than the solution?
Well, no, faith is not the problem. It's exploitation by politics and politicians and rulers is the problem. And it's been the problem for a very, very long time. I mean, we're still living, despite people's concerns that we're ending the Age of Enlightenment. And the Age of Enlightenment began as a response to 150 years of unimaginable barbarity and cruelty as Christianity went through its Great Reformation in the West. And the foundational texts of the Enlightenment, I'm going to mention two, the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus by Spinoza and the letter concerning toleration by John Locke are both written in a sense to say, for too long, the clergy, whether it be Catholic priests or ministers in the Protestant faith, have had the ear of the prince, and they have been using that access to foment division and to impose their will on the whole society. And they called, both men, Spinoza and Locke, called for toleration. You can have a public space where you can be Catholic and you can be Protestant. You can be Sunni, you could be Shia, although they weren't referring to the Islamic world then. But it's come now in these modern times to the Islamic world. And we've been living, less so today, but we have been living for several decades while the Islamic world has a kind of civil war that's been going on, but it's been fomented by politicians and used by politicians to cement their own power. So there's an element of hypocrisy in all of that. So my own view is faith is personal. Faith is what you were brought up in, and it should stay personal. But you have to be very careful when you bring it into the world of politics, because then it becomes a different game.
There is, Catherine, a kind of a depressing repetitiveness of this, isn't there? That, you know, in the 16th and 17th century, it was Catholics who were feared by some because they were said to have divided loyalties. How can they be loyal to our country when they still have this loyalty to the Pope in Rome, who is a foreign prince? We've heard the same about Jews many times over their history of being said, well, they're a rootless people, they can't have any loyalty. Now we hear it about Muslims. We've heard it people, we had it in various forms that sound quite benign. The cricket test in the early 80s, could you really be truly British if you were cheering India at cricket, for example? That's the benign end, but it can slide very quickly into something much more sinister and more negative. Is part of the problem, though, that faith itself encourages this? One thinks of the crime of apostasy, the idea that you can be of the same faith, but if you deviate in a particular way, then you are somehow betraying that faith.
Well, Michael just mentioned that politics is the problem rather than faith. I think it might possibly be human nature that's actually the problem. These difficulties keep coming through over and over again. And I think one area where we're seeing this insistence on loyalty is in China. And we see this time and time again. The Chinese, the Communist Party, seems to not be able to abide the idea that people could have a loyalty, a devotion to a particular religious faith, and also, you know, be Chinese, be accepting of their government. And if there's one area of Pope Francis' pontificate that is hugely controversial, I think it's his endeavours to try and form some kind of dialogue with the Chinese, which seems, frankly, to not be getting Christians in that country any further down the road to some kind of normal life. It seems to be an intractable problem, and his attempts at reconciliation there and dialogue with the Chinese, I don't know if he's naive, but it's not getting anybody very far.
Vincent Lee, let me bring you in at that point, because that's a really interesting example, isn't it? The what had been the persecution of Christians, Catholics in modern day China, and then this kind of insistence from the Chinese leadership, as I understand it, that actually, all right, you can have Chinese bishops, you can have practice, but we kind of have to have a bit of approval about who these people are you're putting in charge, because you're almost setting them up as a rival authority.
Yeah, I think, I agree with what Michael said earlier. Religion itself might not be a problem, but when religion is mixed up with politics, whether it's internal politics or external geopolitics, it will become a problem. In the case of Xinjiang, Catherine mentioned earlier, I think, from China's perspective, from Beijing's leaders' perspective, when they look at map where Xinjiang lies, it is bordered by 8 countries, and from Pakistan to India to Afghanistan to Russia. And
so again, we're talking about that divided loyalty concept, and
exactly.
That faith is one of the things that sometimes political leaders see as a potential threat.
Yes, there is an element of internal security. There's also an element of external geopolitics here. I think, when it comes to faith, when it comes to politics, if they are mixed together, here's where the controversy lies. And not just in China, but also in Myanmar, for example, we have seen the plight of Rohingya Muslims. Buddhist monks becoming very political as well. Some high-profile ones even reportedly said things like, every Muslim is dangerous. So this is where, things start to get out of control. You have, religion is mixed with politics.
Now, that's a really interesting example, isn't it? Because we're at a point where in Myanmar, there is a kind of very arguably quite poisonous link now between ethnic identity and faith. So if you are a nationalist loyal to Myanmar as a concept, you're likely to be Buddhist. I think 90% of the population is Buddhist, isn't it? And as you say, this idea that a Muslim, any Muslim, is potentially dangerous, and we saw the terrible consequences of that with the treatment of the Rohingya minority. Is there any kind of pushback? Is there any sense that there are people who are uncomfortable with the way this has gone?
Well, certainly there was international outrage. Over the last 3 or 4 years, we've seen reporters going into either Myanmar or in neighboring countries reporting on the plight of Rohingya Muslims, and also Pope Francis last year also mentioned Yazidis, Uyghurs, and Rohingyas, calling them persecuted people. So there is pushback, international pushback, but we all know what's happening in Myanmar today, and there doesn't seem to be an opportunity to have a dialogue between what's happening in Myanmar and what's perceived outside of Myanmar.
As you say, it's not dialogue. It's kind of dispersal and execution for those who are protesting. Michael, just picking up on this, it takes us back to the idea of the politics. If we're talking about reconciliation and we talk about politics, it's hard not to think of the United States. And again, weirdly, there's almost a sense that as the practice of religion has declined, or at least the organised practice of religion, some of that passion has gone from faith into politics, and politics has become almost a form of religion in itself.
Well, on one side, certainly. And let me just, before I come back to that,
yes,
I just want to pick up on something Vincent was saying. One of the interesting things, and this is, again, politics and religion, is that neither Pakistan nor Turkey, which are Muslim countries, has been particularly loud in criticizing China for its treatment of its Muslim minority in Xinjiang. And that is realpolitik writ large. I mean, certainly Turkey, actually, both leaders of both countries are very, very, they would call themselves Islamic politicians, I think, and yet they're not standing up for their Muslim brothers. But coming back to America, there's some very, very interesting opinion research came out this week from Pew, which is a very, very good place to check for people who are interested in America. They sample all kinds of opinion, which shows that despite the fact that Americans profess religion, and it's the most religious country in the West, actually, church attendance has gone way down. Now, they haven't explained why that should happen over the last 4 or 5 years, but my guess is that so-called evangelical Christians, and really they're political Christians, have become so dominant in parts of the country that there are many people in the South, in Texas, in the West now, who would consider themselves in religious terms to be evangelical, but don't want to go to church on Sunday and have a political agenda poured down their throats, so they stop going to church. And I think that part of the problem in America, and one of the reasons why people have such a hard time talking, and it does seem to be going through, I think it's in a state of cold civil war, is that there is the religious element. There's this sense that this is my faith. I am right. My political opinion is right. And that is more than just, an intellectual thing. That is something that I believe. This is what the United States is, or was when it was founded, and is no longer. And I will fight, people use the word fight, to make it what it was at its founding. And that is tied in with this political Christianity. And it's a big problem.
And that's a really interesting aspect of this, Catherine, when we talk about the idea of reconciliation, and you were saying about the importance of dialogue. Dialogue only works if people are talking to each other, not past each other. And in a sense, some of that idea is this sense that for some in terms of the practice of their politics, they don't have to be convinced by facts anymore. It is an act of faith to believe in the ideology they believe in. How do you kind of start to disentangle that, to be able to change people's minds if they fear that in changing their minds, somehow they're losing their identity?
Well, I think one of the problems that we have right now is the impact of social media, because I think social media is upping the ante all the time. It's making people much more divided rather than bringing them together. And what it does is that people follow those whom they agree with most of the time, except when they're unbelievably hostile to those they disagree with. And what we see lacking in social media, and I think we see lacking so often in these divisions and conflicts that we're talking about here, is that there seems to be a complete lack of humility. There's an assumption that one side is right and the other side is completely wrong and can be completely dismissed. And I think if you're going to have dialogue, you've got to have that kind of humility to develop as well. And I think we see an enormous lack of that in politics as well. That the conflicts often involving politics, whether religion's part of it or not, the situation is made even more difficult because of this lack of humility. And I'm not sure quite how you encourage people to develop that kind of humility, but when it's lacking, we just don't get the dialogue that's needed.
And we get in a country like, think of Brazil, a hugely successful, powerful country, a country that many admire, and other countries aspire to be like Brazil, to have gone from where Brazil was to where Brazil is now. But its politics has become increasingly, Vincent, polarised, increasingly distrustful, increasingly convinced that the other side are corrupt and therefore you can't possibly engage with them. President Bolsonaro now facing his former rival, the former president, rather, Lula da Silva, who's become the focus of this. I mean, it's hard to see how that country gets to a stage of reconciliation without something much worse first.
Yeah, totally. I mean, you know, in a polarized world, it is ordinary people who bear the brunt of the polarization, really. You know, look at what's happening in Brazil when it comes to COVID health crisis. And the vaccine is, you know, not largely rolled out yet in the country. And top leadership, President Bolsonaro has been very reluctant to recommend people to get vaccine, to be inoculated, etc. So it is the ordinary people who are, you know, suffering from the political polarization, and that's the problem. That is the lack of leadership, whether it's in Brazil or whether, you know, it is in the United States. Biden certainly wants to bring the country together, but it's going to take him a long time, if not years, to make it happen. He's now starting from building infrastructure, you know, getting Americans inoculated by sometime in the summer. But again, you know, we are facing this unprecedented scenario now. We don't know whether there's going to be an economic crisis following this health crisis. We don't know how the great power competition between US and China are going to develop. So this is a really divided and divisive world where there is no apparent leader who can bring everybody together from the international level and from individual countries level.
I want to perhaps end on the pandemic, but just picking up what we were talking about a little earlier, Michael. Catherine gave some examples of places where reconciliations involve dialogue. She mentioned South Africa. Northern Ireland has had a peace process of sorts, but you could question whether there was actually truly kind of reconciliation. Certainly there was dialogue, but whether there was an accounting for past crimes. One country that seems to be happening in a way that perhaps has surprised people is Colombia, where the big process has actually led to some former leaders of the FARC rebel group actually being charged with war crimes. So instead of saying, actually, we're going to kind of make, least said, soonest mended, they're taking the reverse approach. Is that a productive one, do you think?
Well, I think, in the case of Colombia, I mean, part of it, you have to, there's some countries where you can bolster these things through aid. And let's be clear, that's what happened in South Africa and to a very considerable degree in Northern Ireland, where there was a lot of inward investment from the United States to make sure that in this transition period where people who've been fighting insurgencies against one another for decades, in the case of Colombia, going back to the 1960s, have an opportunity to talk and to deal with one another in a world where economic gain is being more evenly spread. And this perhaps can bring us back to America, where because inequality has been growing at such a pace, people don't really feel like they have that kind of economic stake in the overall health of the society. Whereas in Colombia, that seems to be different. It should also be said that if you know enough about the wars that were fought in Colombia between the FARC and other groups and various governments, and you know what half a century feels like. I'm now so old, I do know what half a century feels like. You might just be inclined to just say, we don't have to fight about this stuff.
Yes.
We really don't. So time also heals to a certain degree.
And that is some message of hope and optimism, Catherine. And I suppose one element is this: we've had it in different forms. We've had people trying to apologise or account for what has been done, not even necessarily by him. In a small, whether it's apologies for historic child sexual abuse, whether it's apologies for for slavery and the Atlantic slave trade, whether in the most recent example it's a university, a relatively small institution in a part of the United Kingdom saying, out of step with lots of other institutions around the world, actually we've got this thing, we've got this bronze which was pillaged from Benin in what is now Nigeria. It's actually intolerable for us to keep it. We're going to give it back. Small acts that might have a bigger resonance.
Yes, I think when we look at an issue such as we have this morning, conflict across the world, it is easy to become very pessimistic. But I think you've just mentioned small acts. And I think if you look across society, and we've seen this particularly in the pandemic, that there are countless small acts that do make a difference. I think the pandemic has exacerbated existing problems. Michael's just mentioning inequality. We've seen how inequality in the UK has really been exacerbated by the pandemic. But the pandemic has also highlighted the capacity for humanity to do good as well. And I think that's something that perhaps at Easter we can celebrate.
Vincent, just on that thought, we've had this call from a number of world leaders, including Boris Johnson in the UK, Angela Merkel, President Macron, in a sense acknowledging that they are not adequate as individuals for the crisis. Who is the talk of a pandemic treaty for future pandemics, a realisation that actually we genuinely are all in it together, and to put meaning into that phrase, particularly after the quarrels over vaccine nationalism. Do you think it's possible? Has it been such a bad experience for the world that this might be the thing to galvanise us to do something together?
This is a really positive step. Some 25 countries have joined the cause to establish this treaty. But I think devil is always in the detail, and it's also in process. We are in the time of, every country believes they have the right to set the rules. It's ultimately about who sets the rules. It is about whether it's US or China or EU or the UK. And it is a very positive step, but it is going to take some time. And especially in the context of negotiating a multilateral treaty, we know how notorious it can be sometimes. So it is positive, but I'm afraid it's going to take some time.
Well, time is one thing we have on our hands for now, not least many people sitting at home. Thank you for being with us. Thanks to Catherine and to Michael, and to you, Vincent, and to you for watching us. I'm mindful of remembering that sometimes you have to make compromises. What is it that Protestant prince said after the years of religion, of massacre, of terrible acts in France, when he said, Paris is worth a mass? From all of us on Dateline, have a good weekend. We'll see you the same time next week. Bye-bye.